In early June 1944, a battalion surgeon aboard a vessel heading toward the island of Saipan spoke to a group of Marines about the dangers they might face. He listed sea creatures such as barracudas, sea snakes, anemones, razor-sharp coral, polluted waters, poisonous fish, and giant clams that could trap a man like a bear trap. He also warned them about diseases like leprosy, typhus, fascioliasis, typhoid, and dengue fever, as well as natural hazards like sabergrass, swarms of flies, snakes, and giant lizards. The surgeon continued explaining what to expect, cautioning them not to eat any food growing on the island, not to drink the water, and to avoid the local inhabitants. After he finished, he looked out at the men and asked if there were any questions. One private raised his hand and asked why they didn't just let the Japanese keep the island. The surgeon didn't offer a response, but the real reason lay in the island's military value. A Japanese airbase named Aslito Airport, located on the southern end of Saipan, was a key reason for the island's strategic importance. It stood between Japan's home islands and the major Japanese naval base at Truk, making it one of the most important enemy airfields. Saipan also featured a harbor at Tanapag, which had been improved by the Japanese. However, the primary American objective was Aslito Field. As early as January 1943, the combined chiefs of staff had identified Saipan's strategic potential as a forward base in the island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Saipan and the other Mariana Islands would serve as critical refueling points for American ships and submarines. Most importantly, Saipan would become a base for the long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers that could reach Tokyo, only 1,500 miles away. By seizing Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the largest of the Marianas, the United States could bring the B-29 bombers significantly closer to Japan. Controlling these islands would also help neutralize the Japanese base at Truk, known as Japan's Pearl Harbor. The Japanese High Command was well aware of the island's strategic value and expected an American assault. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the newly formed Central Pacific Area Fleet, noted in a report dated June 14, 1944, that the Americans would likely arrive in the Marianas that month or the next. His prediction was accurate. The first of 3 American landings in the Marianas would take place on Saipan, followed by Tinian and Guam. Roughly 30,000 Japanese troops had been stationed to defend Saipan by the time of Nagumo's report. Most belonged to the 43rd Division. Nagumo took command of the island's defense, but upon his arrival, he received grim news from General Yoshitsugu Saito, who oversaw the land forces in the Marianas. Saito explained that the defenses were inadequate, and the troops were helpless without key supplies like cement, steel reinforcements, barbed wire, and lumber, none of which were available. Though Japan had tried to send thousands of tons of construction materials to the island, American submarines had sunk the supply ships before they could arrive. No more supplies would be coming, and the Japanese defenders would have to make do with what they had. They would also need a considerable amount of luck. By early June, a massive American fleet was on its way to Saipan. This force included transport ships carrying Marines from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, as well as battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division would also join them later. Among the fleet were 4 battleships, California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee, that had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Marines on the transport ships focused on preparing for the invasion. They sharpened bayonets, checked machine gun belts, and tried to imagine the battle ahead on an island many had never even heard of. On June 7th, news reached the fleet that distracted them from their anxiety. Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of Western Europe had begun with Operation Overlord. The message was short and direct on most ships. The invasion of France had begun. On the aircraft carrier Enterprise, detailed reports were distributed. Men leaned over each other's shoulders to read them. Some whispered prayers or said, "Thank God," while others simply felt relieved. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the Joint Expeditionary Force, welcomed the news like everyone else, but he had more urgent matters to attend to. Turner was a seasoned leader in amphibious warfare, having commanded operations in Guadalcanal, the Central Solomons, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls. The Marianas campaign would be his fifth major landing operation, and he was prepared to apply all his knowledge and experience. On June 15, 1944, Turner scheduled the assault on Saipan. The outcome would affect the timing of invasions on Guam and Tinian. The sooner Saipan was secured, the sooner the other landings could begin. The overall operation was code-named Forager, covering the capture of all three islands. A fast carrier group under Admiral Mark Mitcher launched airstrikes on Saipan and Tinian ahead of Turner's landing force. On June 11th, more than 200 fighters and bombers hit the islands from 11 aircraft carriers, destroying over 100 Japanese planes on Saipan. 2 days later, the American warships arrived and began a heavy naval bombardment, continuing until just before the troops were to land. From the perspective of the gunners aboard the ships, it seemed impossible that anything could have survived the shelling. At 5:50 a.m. on June 15th, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers launched one final bombardment of Saipan. 12 minutes later, Admiral Turner ordered the landing force ashore. Onboard chaplains offered final blessings and prayers over loudspeakers. One chaplain said that most of the men would return, but some would meet their maker that day. A nearby officer turned to a war correspondent and remarked that he wished that thought had been left unspoken. Although the landings weren't scheduled until 8 a.m., more than 700 landing craft, carrying 8 battalions from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, began moving toward Saipan's western coast just before the hour. At 8:44 a.m., the first landing units hit Beach Red 2, where they were met with heavy resistance. The Japanese fired artillery, mortars, small arms, and anti-boat guns positioned to cover the beach, according to a Marine colonel who served as operations officer. American battleships continued firing at inland targets from offshore, while other ships crossed the channel between Saipan and Tinian to bombard the southern tip of Saipan. As the landing craft neared the shore, Japanese artillery hit the battleship Tennessee and Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship, the cruiser Indianapolis. The landing craft also came under fire during their final approach. For the troops inside, the 1,500-yard run to the beach must have felt much longer. Shells exploded all around, striking some boats and sinking others, but the rest pushed forward because they had no choice. The Marines leapt from the landing craft and moved quickly, keeping low to avoid enemy fire on the beach. As they landed, dozens of American planes swept in, strafing Japanese positions, while battleships pounded the shore guns. One observer described the scene as well-organized chaos. Admiral Nagumo, positioned in a 30-foot observation tower just north of the invasion beaches, watched the landings unfold. He was mesmerized by the sight of the vast American fleet. Gazing out to sea, the former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack seemed particularly focused on the battleships waiting offshore. According to his aide Mitsuharu Nota, Nagumo pointed out that 4 of those battleships had once been targets of his carrier-based planes at Pearl Harbor. There was both admiration and unease in his voice as he recalled it. After fighting their way off the beach, the Marines moved toward the abandoned settlement of Charancanoa. Most expected to find simple bamboo and paper houses, but instead they were met with rows of sturdy concrete pillboxes, some 2 stories high, many covered in blooming bougainvillea. In the heart of the village, they stumbled upon a baseball stadium with a grandstand and a diamond. Nearby stood a Buddhist temple. At Charancanoa, Captain John C. Chapin and his men from G Company of the 24th Marines paused to fill their canteens. but they had barely stopped when mortar shells rained down on them. Everyone had been so focused on clearing out the pillboxes that they overlooked a tall smokestack from a sugar refinery in the distance. At its peak, a Japanese spotter was using it to direct deadly mortar fire onto the Marines. Saipan later recalled they lost far more men than they should have before the spotter was finally taken out. He didn't say how many of his men died, only that the observer had caused severe losses in G Company. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the Japanese 43rd Division, believed he could still hold Saipan despite the American bombardment. Reports coming in told him the Japanese defenders were hitting back hard and inflicting heavy losses on the invaders. The overwhelming display of American power stunned both General Saito and Admiral Nagumo, but they remained confident that the Americans would be repelled and that reinforcements would arrive in time. They believed Saipan would never fall. More artillery came ashore with the Marines to support the push inland. On June 16th, the Army's 27th Infantry Division landed as well. Still, General Saito kept bombarding the landing beaches, inflicting further losses on the Americans in an effort to push them back into the sea before they could establish a solid defense. That night, he ordered a counterattack. General Saito deployed 44 tanks in the night assault, though only about 500 infantry supported the attack. Colonel Hideki Goto's 9th Tank Regiment led the charge just after 3 a.m. on June 17th. Standing upright in the turret of his Type 97 medium tank, Goto opened the hatch, raised his cavalry saber, and struck the side of the tank with it. Other commanders followed his lead, banging their sabers against their tanks in unison before sealing their hatches and advancing toward the American lines. The clatter and rumble of Goto's tanks moving through the dark jungle could be heard by the Marines, though they couldn't yet see them. Some referred to the Type 97s as kitchen sinks because of their bulky sound. Captain Clark Rolland called out that a night attack was coming and requested illumination from the offshore Navy ships. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warships fired so many star shells that the jungle lit up like daytime. Once the Japanese tanks became visible, the Marines opened fire with 37mm guns, bazookas, and grenades. Some tanks halted while others caught fire, lighting up the rest. A Japanese officer jumped from his tank, shouted commands, and climbed back in before sealing his hatch again. The tanks pushed on but were soon hit with more American fire. Marine Private Herbert Hodges destroyed 7 tanks before running out of ammunition. Another Marine took out 4 with his bazooka, then used a hand grenade to disable a 5th. By daylight, nearly all of Goto's tanks were destroyed. A 5-inch naval shell from a destroyer even blew one to pieces. The attack was a complete failure, and the battlefield was strewn with the remains of the tanks. By the morning of June 17th, the beachhead on Saipan was secured. The Americans held the landing zones but had paid dearly, suffering nearly 3,500 casualties. The Aslito airfield remained under Japanese control, and much of the island was still contested. Units from the 2nd Marine Division launched another offensive less than an hour after surviving Goto's tank assault. By the end of the day, the beachhead north of Beach Green 3 had more than doubled in size. General Holland M. Smith, who commanded all American ground forces on Saipan, established his headquarters at Charan Kanoa. By 2 p.m., the Army's 27th Infantry Division had reached the Aslito airfield perimeter, and the 24th Marines had captured high ground overlooking the airstrip. Admiral Nagumo and General Saito still believed reinforcements were on the way. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had ordered a Japanese fleet to strike the Americans in the Marianas, destroy their fleet, and land reinforcements on Saipan. Once the U.S. Navy was out of the way, the Japanese expected to either kill or capture all enemy forces on the island. But events took a different turn. On June 19th, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 engaged Ozawa's fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Neither Nagumo, Saito, nor Ozawa anticipated the result. The Japanese suffered a crushing defeat in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They lost hundreds of aircraft and 3 carriers. Ozawa's fleet retreated. With no Japanese naval support nearby, the garrison on Saipan was cut off. There were still attempts to reinforce the defenders. Some efforts were made to move troops across the Saipan Channel, but American warships patrolled the narrow strait too closely. 13 landing barges carrying men and supplies attempted to transport 2 infantry regiments from Guam, but they never made it. The closest they got was the island of Rota, about a third of the way between Guam and Tinian, where they remained for the rest of the war. The destruction of the Japanese fleet sealed the fate of the forces on Saipan. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote that the Japanese defenders made the United States pay a heavy price for the island. One Japanese tanker who had not participated in the failed night attack wrote in his journal that only 12 tanks remained in their regiment. He ended his note with a vow that they would fight hand to hand, even without tanks. I have decided to end my 24-year life by raising my sword and fighting the enemy for as long as I can in the rugged terrain that favored the defenders. On Mount Tapachao, the general positioned his remaining troops and artillery in defensive spots. Japanese soldiers used the mountain's caves to ambush the Marines, often launching attacks at night. These areas came to be known by grim names like Hell's Pocket, Death Valley, and Purple Heart Ridge. The Japanese were just as determined to defend Saipan as the Americans were to take it. On June 20th, Marine Captain John C. Chapin watched as a unit from the 4th Marine Division attacked. The fighting took place just a quarter-mile ahead of him, giving him a clear view. He saw the Marines assault Hill 500, the highest ground in the area, and run straight into heavy enemy fire. Despite this, they pressed forward, supported by artillery, smoke, and tanks, and eventually captured the hill. The primary objective, Aslito Airfield, had already been secured. In memory of Commander Robert H. Isley, who had died 5 days earlier, the airfield was renamed Isley Field. He had crashed on the southern side of the runway after his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. 4 days later, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19th Fighter Squadron arrived at Isley Field from the carriers Manila Bay and Natoma Bay. Now equipped with rockets, they soon launched a strike on Tinian. By late 1944, B-29 superfortresses would fly from Isley Field to bomb Japanese cities. During the Battle for Saipan, tension between military branches also surfaced. On June 22nd, the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division was placed between the 2 Marine divisions. While the Marines captured Mount Tapachao and Mount Tipo Pale, the 27th Division lagged behind, creating a gap in the front lines. Major General Ralph C. Smith's division couldn't keep pace with the more aggressive Marine units, frustrating Marine General Holland Smith, who already distrusted the Army. He blamed Ralph Smith for the slow progress and requested that he be relieved of command. After raising the issue with Admiral Turner and with Admiral Raymond Spruance's approval, Smith was replaced by Army Major General Sanderford Jarman, who believed that new leadership could get the 27th Division back on track. Despite the leadership change, the pace of the advance didn't change significantly. The 2nd Marine Division fought through 3 days of brutal combat, facing fierce banzai attacks. Meanwhile, the 27th Division pushed forward slowly. Japanese forces retreated into Saipan's rugged interior, which provided excellent defensive positions. The rough terrain, with its slopes and caves, helped the defenders slow the Americans as effectively as direct combat. These natural features gave Japanese snipers clear shots and wide fields of fire, doing more to halt the advance than the dwindling number of troops under General Saito. By June 25th, only 3 tanks and about 1,200 fit Japanese soldiers remained. General Saito received a report from one of his commanders, General Keiji Ida, that the situation was hopeless. The enemy controlled the sea, the air, and had overwhelming firepower. Yet, no surrender was planned. They were ordered to defend their positions to the end. American forces kept advancing north. A Marine from the 23rd Regiment explained how they tackled enemy cave defenses. Multiple cave entrances often supported each other, so their specialists would approach while others provided covering fire. They used satchel charges or grenades to blast the caves open. Offshore warships gave crucial support. One captured Japanese soldier told interrogators that naval gunfire was the main reason for the Americans' success on Saipan and was feared even more than artillery or air attacks. Sometimes battleships would temporarily leave Saipan to prepare Tinian and Guam for upcoming landings. Around midnight on June 27th, about 500 Japanese soldiers broke through the American lines near Isley Field, destroying 2 P-47s and setting another on fire. They moved to nearby high ground and clashed with Marines until morning. The Japanese lost 140 men. The Marines lost 33. Later that day, surviving Japanese were captured or killed. By the end of June, the Japanese defense was crumbling. One of General Saito's battalions was down to only 100 men, and his headquarters had been moved to a cave at the northern tip of the island. Still, the Japanese refused to surrender. Their resistance became scattered, desperate, and isolated. American forces pressed on. On July 3rd, soldiers from the 2nd Marine Division took control of Garapan, a city that once held 15,000 residents. Now it was a ruined shell, with streets littered with belongings, pots, clothes, and personal items left behind in the evacuation. The Marines encountered little resistance, though one sniper did fire from a rooftop. That night, about 200 Japanese soldiers returned and surprised the Marines the next morning. A bloody fight followed, but the Japanese were driven out. The Marines then set up a command post across from what was left of the local bank on a main street they called Broadway. Just north of Garapan, the Japanese made one last stand. Few remained, and those who did were starving, forced to eat grass and bark to survive. Some hid in caves to ambush passing Marines, even smearing themselves in blood to remain unnoticed until they could strike. In response, American soldiers bayoneted all enemy bodies, dead or alive. A Marine officer said it was necessary. During the first week of July, U.S. forces closed in on Marpy Point, the island's northern tip. Japanese troops retreated, but had no place left to go. General Holland Smith predicted they would stage a final banzai charge, the typical last act of Japanese troops under siege. At Japanese headquarters, it was decided that all remaining forces would unite for one last attack. Even the final rations were eaten by the staff in preparation. On the evening of June 5th, General S. was asked by a staff officer if he planned to participate in the coming attack. Instead of answering directly, Admiral Nemo declared that he, General S., and General Ada would all take their own lives. The following day was spent preparing for the assault. Soldiers and sailors, armed with everything from firearms to swords and bamboo spears, gathered for the attack. They wore ordinary clothing and appeared lifeless and resigned, like sheep being led to slaughter, as one staff officer observed. General Holland Smith personally visited the senior officers of the 27th Division on July 6th to inform them that a banzai attack was expected within 12 hours in the Tanapag Plains. He was correct. Up to this point, the Japanese had mounted almost no resistance to the American invasion from the southern part of the island. The continuous movement of American troops prevented the Japanese from forming a stable defensive line. One Marine described the operation as a rabbit hunt. By July 6th, all remaining Japanese forces were trapped at the northern tip of the island. At about 4 a.m. on July 7th, the Japanese defenders arrived at their starting point on the northwest shore and prepared to move toward Tanapag Hamlet. As the sky began to brighten, the order to attack was given. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 27th Infantry Division. A Marine who witnessed the attack described a sudden eruption of noise, like 1,000 people screaming at once, followed by a wave of men breaking out of the darkness. An officer likened it to a stampede in an old Wild West movie, and another compared it to a crowd rushing the field after a football game. Each Japanese soldier had a single goal: to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. They kept coming without hesitation. Despite the overwhelming onslaught, the American forces stood their ground. One Marine recalled that their mortars and machine guns fired non-stop. As the Japanese charged, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the weapons overheated, making some of them unusable. Even wounded Japanese soldiers, some on crutches, followed the charge, carrying swords and bamboo spears, determined to die for the emperor. The sheer pressure of the assault forced the Americans to retreat slightly. Using everything they had, 105mm howitzers, .50 caliber machine guns, bayonets, and even rifle butts, they managed to slow the attack. The 2 battalions of the 105th Infantry formed a defensive ring near Tanapag Hamlet. By late afternoon, the Japanese momentum had faltered, and the attack was stopped entirely. The Americans had killed approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers while suffering about 1,000 casualties themselves. In total, over 4,300 Japanese died in the suicide charge. By around 10 a.m. on July 6th, Ada and Nemo had kept their grim promise and were dead. Their attendants had shot them all in the head. Admiral Nemo specifically requested a Navy officer to carry out the act. The death of the once powerful commander of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force in an obscure cave on Saipan seemed ironic to Admiral Morrison. The day after the massive suicide charge, American forces began their final cleanup operation on the island. Holland Smith moved most of the 27th Division into reserve and ordered the 105th Infantry Regiment and the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions to push north toward Marpy Point. The remaining Japanese offered fierce resistance. Miniature versions of the suicide charge occurred again, as the last Japanese defenders made their final stands. On July 9th, Marines reached Marpy Point. The 4th Division took control of an unfinished runway at the island's northern tip. At 4:15 p.m., Admiral Turner officially declared Saipan secured. The Americans were now preparing to target Guam and Tinian, Saipan's sister islands. Although the battle was officially over, sporadic fighting continued. Small groups of Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden caves to attack American troops for weeks. Some of these attacks took place at night. American destroyers supported infantry efforts by firing star shells and occasional gunfire. On the morning of July 10th, a flag-raising ceremony took place at General Smith's headquarters, but on July 11th, a tragic and gruesome chapter followed. Misled by Japanese propaganda, hundreds of civilians, possibly up to 1,000, chose suicide over surrender. The propaganda had convinced them that Americans would torture, dismember, and kill anyone they captured. About 25,000 civilians lived on Saipan, most with little education, and many believed what they were told. Some leapt from the island's steep northern cliffs into the sea.